Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sweet.
Commissioner Bolio, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
S56.
Yes. So I'll jump right in. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. Sorry.
Happy for you to jump right in. I want to make sure we save time for some technical questions that we have and
Oh, sure.
sort of big picture thinking.
Okay. Sure. So thanks for the opportunity to come and speak on this. As you've heard directly from the governor a number of times, that should come as no surprise. The administration is not keen on pursuing a big income tax increase, but the administration recognizes that we have shared values, right? And so the governor did put forward a significant investment in childcare in his recommended budget. As you look at, we're a small state, right? Second smallest state in the country by population, just ahead of Wyoming. If you were to put all of our people into one city, we'd be the 25th largest city in the country, behind Boston, right? And so we have a small tax base as a result of that. And that tax base is pretty highly burdened right now, right? If you look at, I put an analysis in my memo from the Tax Foundation that does a state and local tax burden analysis. And they do a lot of work. They start with the census data on state and local governments and tax collections. And then they do a lot of work to try to make sure that they're really capturing where the economic incidence of taxes are, right? So for instance, you could think of a Vermonter who drives over the border and works in Massachusetts every day, right? Those are Massachusetts tax collections on paper, but those are a Vermonter paying them. So the Tax Foundation does a lot of work to try to make sure that who's actually paying the taxes is reflected in that analysis. And based on that analysis, it shows that Vermonters currently pay 13.6% of their income in state and local taxes, which is higher than any other state except for New York, Connecticut, and Hawaii. Now, the bill that we're talking about today has a $178 million income tax increase attached to it, right? About 127 million of that in tax year 24, and then another 51 and change in tax year 28, I believe. So that's in addition to an $80 million property tax increase that we all recognize Vermonters are likely expected to pay. And we all recognize that neither the legislature or administration have the power to fully mitigate, right? So that's going to be happening. There's also the $107 million payroll tax in H66. So if you add that all up, we're talking about over $365 million in tax increases this year. That would catapult us over Hawaii to be the third most taxed state in the country. And at a time where, things like food and housing cost more than ever, the administration remains very concerned about the impacts to average Vermonters with a tax increase of that size. We're also worried about potential economic downturn, right? We've heard banks failing around the country. We are hearing about concerns about the debt ceiling and U.S. defaulting. And we just had a pretty big miss in April revenues. So we missed the April personal income tax revenues by $43 million. So we were $43 million less than forecasted from the consensus revenue forecast. And that was already a reduction from last year. So we actually were more than $100 million less than last April. As you look around the country, and I provided a couple of articles in my memo, a lot of states are starting to really worry about what the fiscal future looks like because of these characteristics going on and these trends going on around the country. California seems to be facing a $24 billion budget deficit. New York, over 3 years, is projecting a $22 billion budget deficit, right? And I don't think any of us want to be in the position of having to respond to troubles like that. And so I think the question really has to be asked, when the next downturn comes, where is that tax capacity going to come from to be able to maintain the programs and the services? And maybe to continue on that note of reliability and volatility, right? We all recognize and we all appreciate that Vermont has one of the most progressive income tax systems in the country. We're ranked number 2 most progressive, I think, behind California by the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, right? So everybody accepts that. That's a Vermont value, right? We appreciate that. But we need to flag, right, that based on the Joint Fiscal Office analysis, this change in taxes would make 63% of the new taxes paid by 8.5% of Vermont taxpayers. And we like to say at the tax department, we don't have a lot of rich people in Vermont. We have a lot of rich moments. We have a lot of one-time events where people happen to be rich that year, but we don't have a lot of folks who are rich year over year. And so I just think we've got to acknowledge that having something that top heavy on top of what's already a very progressive system could introduce volatility because it's going to put more of the health of the general fund revenues on these one-time events from folks, right? And I put a comparison in my memo that over the last 5 tax years, if you were to look at that same percentage of amount of taxes paid by those with over $200,000 of income, it's about 40%, right? So it's a big jump to 63%. And again, I want to recognize we all acknowledge that those who earn the most should pay the most, but we've also got to be realistic about what changes in the economy and the tax policy can do to that space. And the last thing that I want to flag, maybe not necessarily, it's not directly related to the income tax increase, but just as we're discussing the cost of childcare, and I recognize I'm not the childcare policy guy, so I don't want to wade too far into this, but as I've heard this committee discuss, the S56 as passed by the Senate repealed the child tax credit, right? And that was very troubling to the administration, particularly because there was an acknowledgement that the lowest income Vermonters at and below 150% of federal poverty level already have a full subsidy under the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. And so they would not necessarily directly gain anything by a change in the system, but they were going to lose the child tax credit. And I had provided data that I've replicated in my memo that as of late March of this year, 40% of the child tax credit money was going to people at and below the 150% of federal poverty level. So that's a big tax increase on the lowest income Vermonters. I fully recognize this committee is not interested in repealing the child tax credit, and the administration appreciates that. But I also want to flag that the RAND report did not include any of the nearly $32 million that is projected for child tax credit to be part of the current investment in the system. And that also doesn't feel correct to me. Right? So 60% of the child tax credit money as of late March is going to people who do shoulder some cost for childcare. And they very well may use part of their child tax credit for childcare. So I want to be really clear. I'm not saying this as a suggestion to scale back the child tax credit. The administration is not interested in doing that, but rather just acknowledge that there are investments in the system that were not necessarily accounted for in the RAND report and probably should be in one way or another. Because what the flexibility of the child tax credit does is let those people keep that money in their pocket and use it however is best for them and their families, which I think we all acknowledge is helpful in this space. There are a few other provisions in S56 not related to the income tax increase that I just wanted to hit on. As what should come as no surprise, the administration is appreciative of the committee's interest in the earned income tax credit increase. That's true. It is related to income taxes. We prefer that it is not tied to one of the largest income tax increases in Vermont history. We also have no problem with having a different percentage for those without children and those with children. The line for us was as long as it is at least 45% for everybody, which this bill does have. I also recognize it seems that the committee is interested in adjusting the Vermont Child Tax Credit and Vermont Earned Income Tax Credit to no longer require a social security number for recipients. We accept both of those changes. I do want to just highlight for expectation setting, there may be situations where it's not super easy for those folks to claim the credit. For better or worse, like the unfortunate reality is when we deviate from federal rules, right? We either have to build up those forms ourselves or we have to ask those taxpayers to file a pro forma return. It's a little bit of a hassle and there's just not much that anybody can do about it. But I just want to set that expectation that there may be situations where it's a little harder for these folks to get the credit than it would be for folks who just have the social security number. That's not us trying to give them a hard time. It's just the unfortunate reality of deviating from the federal requirements. And then I recognize in the latest draft that the provisions of S45, the salt cap workaround pass-through entity tax, were added to S56. I think the committee knows my perspective on that bill. But I did bring my whole presentation if you want to go through it again. I'm happy to. No. We could do like a call and response, right? Like it's the closest thing to yeah, well, I did not think that would work. Thank you. I'm going to step out of the chair now.
What about EIT for rich people? Like free lunch, but like.
I have no comment on that. So look, again, the administration and legislature, I think, have shared values on this. We'd be excited to work on these other provisions as well outside of a big tax increase, but the governor just can't get behind an income tax increase, certainly of this size. And yeah, thanks for having me in.
Appreciate your comments. They're always clear, even if we don't exactly agree.
I appreciate that.
The thing that I've been pondering is the absolute necessity for working families to have access to quality, affordable childcare. And it's more and more important these days than it was, successive times going backwards all the time. And it's clear because of the way the economy is going. I wouldn't say Vermont values are changing, but many Vermont families' needs have changed pretty significantly over time. I was listening to Senator Rogers, former, the other day on Erica Heilman, and it occurred to me that what he was talking about values changing and imposition on traditional rights and whatnot, but back there in the back of his mind, what he wasn't expressing, it seems to me, was just what I was saying, that what's changes is Vermont families' needs, and they flow forward to things like this child care bill. So I'm expressing my opinion. Appreciate you listening.
Sure.
And that's sort of where I wanted my way through this.
And acknowledging I'm not the child care policy guy, right? I can't go far into that, but my high level would be, I don't think the administration disagrees with that, right? We need access to affordable and high quality child care and a childhood education system.
Thank you, Commissioner. And again, I second my colleagues' congratulations for candor and straight talking, even if I don't always agree.
Appreciate that.
Owing to part of my background, I threw out for discussion purposes trying to get around the decline in consumption tax because of the decline in the base. And that went across like a big thud. So I reminded myself again from my training that the other downside to a goods-based ad valorem sales tax is that it's pro-cyclical. So when things go bad, they really go bad.
Yeah.
If you expand it into services, they also go bad when they go bad, real bad. It's a pro-cyclical. The virtue of the income tax, again, notwithstanding us being a potential outlier, as you're warning, is it's anti-cyclical. And so if there is a downturn, it's probably the least, if you will, injurious or least self-inflicted, a kind of a cycle of the economy goes down, so the revenues go down, so then we have to cut kind of thing. So I'm willing to disagree with you, partly because I think it's in a way the best protection to buy what we all agreed we need to buy, which is high quality childcare.
I have a few technical questions, but also sort of a clarification. There's a lot that's unstable in the world right now. I think it's very reasonable to be cautious about that. But I think the use of the word downturn in relation to us coming out of what was a federally created bubble is not always sort of an appropriate way to describe it, right? My memory of all of the projections we've gotten from our economists is that we went up very dramatically to the federal spending, and we're coming back down from that, but we're rebasing higher than we were before, and we'll continue growing from there. So, revenues are coming down from last year because we were in this extraordinary episode of federal spending. It's not actually a downturn, it's just sort of like a curve out of a bubble, which I'm sure there's some people who are economics who don't know that, but it's.
Yeah, so fair. I think that's a fair characterization of the existing January forecast. I think what the administration is also concerned about is added uncertainty that didn't exist at that time that might create more of an actual downturn, not just that transition.
Thank you. And then technical questions,
Sure.
if you don't mind. it's more of a philosophical, technical question.
Okay.
But do you, and it's okay if you don't have an answer, but do you have a sense of the proportion of Vermonters' income that's been sort of carried in W-2s across time? I've just been sort of, when I think about the move to sort of more gig economy and Vermonters sort of like long-standing self-employment and small businesses, I'm just wondering if you have a sense of like over the last decade or two, how the mix of W-2 employees to other forms of income has changed in Vermont. And I did not at all tell you I was going to ask you this question. So I was just sort of thinking about it this morning.
I don't have that. I don't know how hard it would be to get. I'm happy to take that back and try to find out.
I'd love to even just like talk about it this summer. I think it's really important that we understand sort of the particular case of Vermont and our particular mix. I think Frank Bryant writes these very, charming pieces about how Vermonters are like particularly protected from downturns in the economy because we're just sort of so far behind cycles often. And I think one sort of piece that impacts us very particularly is like the number of tiny businesses and how few W-2s we tend to have, but I don't know if that's I'd love to see that sort of changing across time. So.
Yeah, happy to take that back. I have one little tidbit that was just interesting to me as we were doing analysis when we looked at the number of self-employed people in Vermont. So I think in tax year 21, we had over 55,000 Schedule SEs, right? So that was a large number, but the majority of them had W-2 income, right? So it was like a lot of folks who have like a side gig kind of thing.
That's true for
Yeah.
And then my much more technical question is about timelines for implementation.
Okay.
So if this passes, would you be able to get sort of new suggested schedules out for January withholding? Is that sort of doable? I imagine, and then the Senate's version of the bill with the payroll tax, I know there's startup costs and startup timing for that. So I just sort of.
Yeah, just a rate change. We would get new withholding tables out at the start of 2024. I don't have concerns on that side. The payroll tax version, and I testified to this in the Senate, required the same 15 resources that we asked you folks for on the payroll tax for age 66. Sure.
I was curious, following our chair's query about W-2 versus the Schedule C or as self-employed people, sole proprietors. I had asked Patrick to disaggregate the pass-through folks as between sole proprietors and LLCs and whatever. And interestingly, half of those were sole proprietors. And
that doesn't shock me.
It doesn't. Okay. I was surprised that we have not only 2 gig, if you will, people, W-2 and sole proprietors, but a huge number of those pass-throughs are not going to be helped, and because in fact they aren't eligible as single filers, and they don't frankly make an awful lot of money.
Yeah, I mean that would be
pay an awful lot of taxes.
The other reason they don't need the workaround.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sure.
It's quick. I just want to make sure I understand the 80 million you're talking about in the base tax. I've lost it already, but that is school property tax
right.
for town meeting.
Yeah. I think when it came out of the House, the Ed Fund Outlook showed an $80.8 million property tax.
Yeah.
And again, there's not a lot that anybody can do to fully mitigate that, but those are real taxes that Vermonters are going to pay.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks. I wondered what data you have over time about the sale of business, as you mentioned that as an income tax item.
I don't have data on that with me. I could try to, let me take that back and see what we can put together on that.
My understanding of sort of the one-time events is that people tend to sort of pop back and forth. Is that what you're talking about, the one-time events? Is that people tend to sort of bop back and forth, like above and below those thresholds. It's not like someone is hanging out down here on the graph and then they bop up.
Keep waiting.
Yes, sorry, I misunderstood it. You were referencing the one time. Yeah, so that, yes, it's not just business sales that trigger that, but generally capital gain events. So yeah, happy to try to grab some data on it. Yeah.
That is my understanding, and I've not used, I'm just describing a graph out loud, but do people sort of tend to hang out near that threshold, or are people really like sort of skyrocketing from, $40,000 a year into one-time event?
I'm not confident enough to answer that without checking it out.
Thanks.
Yeah, in regards to bumping up and
Yeah.
down, Janet Ansel used to describe personal income frequently as lumpy. If people would have a one-time event, sold a business or something like that. By 1 year, somewhere in the middle of the next year, so.
Just maybe echo some colleagues, appreciate the perspective and understand where the administration is coming on this. I think the other piece I would add to what's already been said is, again, appreciate the shared commitment to childcare and recognizing the burden it is for families and businesses that we have a system that isn't working. And, I think what we've heard folks asking for is to solve the problem, and that I think the system is broken in a way that we can't continue to nibble around the edges or do Band-Aids. And I sort of see the administration's proposal as sort of more of the same tweaks that we've been, trying over the last several years to make the system work. And I think, Vermonters are looking to us for transformational change. And I think that's what we're trying to deliver here. And it's a big change, but it's one that I, see as the best way to get to creating a system that really works by creating enough slots at a price that's affordable for families to bring more folks back into the workforce, to provide the steady supply of workers that our businesses need. And that, that's a big change, but I think it's one that most Vermonters are looking for us to make to solve this problem.
I really appreciate that, Representative Sims, because sort of thinking about the global instability that we've talked about, or the national instability that we've talked about, I think the best that we can do here in this tiny state that is the size of some cities is to create that stability for Vermonters by making sure that systems work and services work and their needs are being met. And I think this bill ideally is going to do that. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you coming in. We are.
Sure, you don't want to say free lunch before you leave.
No, we're going to go to the floor, and then ideally we're going to be back here after the floor, but we are done for lunch at 11:30 today, so who knows if that will happen or not.
Lunch is at 11.